Welcome, everyone, to CRI's second in a series of webinars aimed at documenting the effect of the pandemic on the electric utility industry and electrification in general. The topic for today is assessing the long-term impact of the pandemic on the regulatory bargain, and we're going to look at it from the utility company's perspective today. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with CRI, please turn off your speaker if you have it on. For those of you who are not familiar with Rutgers Center for Research and Regulated Industries, it's been in existence for about 40 years. It was founded by Dr. Michael Crew, who was a professor at Rutgers Business School, and he ran it for at least 35 years. The mission of CRI is to promote research in regulatory economics aimed at improving regulatory policy. Typically, CRI has two conferences and several workshops throughout the year, but those have been postponed or canceled. And for the first time, we now have webinars. The main focus of CRI is on utility regulation, and we cover the electric utility industry, telecom, water, gas, and the Postal Service. Today, we have 44 leading experts who are going to tackle three basic questions about the pandemic.
Audiobooks presents The Fourth Hand by John.
And the first basic question is, how has the pandemic affected the operations of electric utility companies? The second basic question is, how have government policies responded to the pandemic, and how have they affected the operations of the electric utility companies? And third basic question is, what do you think is going to be the long-term impact, if any, of the pandemic on an electric utility company's operations and the regulatory framework? The experts we have today are Ahmad Faruqui, Jeff Guldner, Mark Ketschke, and Bob Rowe. And let me give you a little thumbnail sketch of each person before turning over the program to Ahmad Faruqui, who is going to be our moderator. Ahmad is a principal at Brattle. He's been dealing with electric utility affairs for more than 40 years and has covered a wide variety of topics. In his career, he's published more than 100 academic articles and worked with over 150 clients in the United States and around the world. His work has been cited by major publications such as The Economist, Bloomberg Businessweek, and Forbes, and he has appeared on NPR and Fox Business. Please turn off your speaker if you are using one now. Jeff Guldner is our other participant presenter, and Jeff leads Pinnacle West Capital Corporation and its primary subsidiary, Arizona Public Service Company. APS employs more than 3,000 people and provides clean, affordable energy to almost 1.3 million customers across Arizona. Recently, under Jeff's leadership, APS announced that its commitment to providing 100% carbon-free generation by 2050. Somebody, could you please turn off your microphone?
It looks like it's, there you go.
You've got it? Okay. In his previous lives, Jeff was a naval ship officer, a history professor, a utility regulation attorney before joining APS. A very interesting background. Matt Ketschke, another one of our presenters, is Senior Vice President at Consolidated Edison Company of New York, typically known as Con Ed. Con Ed serves about 10 million customers in New York City and Westchester County, which is the county north of New York City. His organization integrates infrastructure planning, and some of the key areas that he focuses on are rate design strategy, electric vehicle initiatives, and the design and implementation of smart metering programs and new customer information systems. Bob Rowe, another one of our presenters, is President and Chief Executive Officer of Northwestern Energy, which serves Montana, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Yellowstone National Park. He's co-chair of the Institute for Electric Innovation and is focused on advancing the adoption of innovative and efficient technologies among electric utilities. Bob's wide view is not surprising. He was former chairman and commissioner at the Montana Public Service Commission, and he also served as the president of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, NARUC. I've known Bob for decades. The format today is panel discussion moderated by Ahmad Faruqui, and that will be followed by open discussion. Again, please turn off your microphone and video camera, and I've opened the chat, and please direct your questions to the moderator, Ahmad. And with that, I will turn over the floor to Ahmad.
Thank you very much, Victor. A pleasure to be here, and we have a very distinguished panel of speakers today with us. We are indeed fortunate that despite the challenges posed by the pandemic and the disruptions that it certainly has caused in our day-to-day lives, that we have three exceptionally qualified individuals to weigh in on the impact the pandemic is having on utility operations in the near term, number one. Number two, the role that governmental policies are playing to facilitate those operations. And number three, as we look at the future, and I'm convinced there will be a future beyond the pandemic, the question is, what will be the shape of that long-term future? Those are the three questions that we have identified. And as Victor mentioned, we had a session earlier, a webinar, a virtual webinar with video, with three folks representing the regulatory side of the industry. And we have decided to keep the same questions for this webinar, which I believe is happening about 6 weeks or so after the previous one. So more data has come in on what the pandemic is doing and what it might do as we look at the future. What I thought would be interesting to do by way of moderating the panel is we have three topics. So let's think of those three topics as being about 20 minutes each. We have three panelists, so roughly 5 to 6 minutes per panelist to make their remarks. And I had to kind of pick a sequencing order in which to have the panelists speak, since this is a virtual platform and we can't have spontaneous and lively debates here. So somewhat arbitrarily, what I have done is, for the first question, which is the near-term impact of the pandemic on utility operations, I want to begin with Jeff as the first speaker, and then go to Matt, and then to Bob in that sequence for the first question. For the second question, we're going to change it. And for the third question, we're going to change it so you won't always be either first or third or in the middle seat, so to speak, in the sequence of the conversation. It's somewhat arbitrary. I hope it'll work. It seemed to work the last time, but those were three different people. And what life has taught me is it is full of uncertainties. So we will see how it goes. So we're going to begin with Jeff. I guess somebody didn't like something I said. So what we're going to do is begin with the topic of what has been the near-term impact of the pandemic on utility operations. And by near-term, obviously what I mean is since it began, which perhaps we could say it began in January, February. So in the first 6 months of the year, what has been the impact of the pandemic on your operations? So why don't we begin with Jeff? Now, I can no longer see his icon.
I'll probably come into screen now. Just it looks like not to call anybody out, but Allison, Tim, you may want to go on mute because it looks like you're not on mute, and that may be where the feedback is coming. And so in terms of the near-term impact, all of us have pandemic plans. We've had those in place for quite a while, and I think the first thing that all of us did was exercise our pandemic plans. I'll just share before talking about what the load impacts and some of the other impacts were on just what our priorities were. And so our immediate priority was really focusing on keeping the lights on. So it was really business continuity and keeping the lights on. We knew that was going to be the most important thing. And just to remind folks, the system doesn't just work automatically. There's a lot of effort that has to go in, particularly around preparing for summer if you're in the Southwest. And so initially, the biggest challenge was working our way through a planned outage at one of our nuclear units at Palo Verde. And so that really caused everybody to come into gear and say, okay, we've got to figure out how we prevent the spread of the virus as we look at how we operate our control rooms, as we look at how we work through outages at both the coal plant and our nuclear plant, where you've got hundreds of contractors that are coming on the site from out of state. And so keeping the lights on, operational continuity was critically important. The second thing was really supporting our customers. And so the initial thing that I think all the utilities did was put a disconnect moratorium in place. That will have an impact on our financials because we know that coming off of a disconnect moratorium, that's going to cause bad debt to increase. But again, we thought it was important, not just for residential, but for our commercial customers as well, to say we're going to put a disconnection moratorium in place so that, people can just focus on getting through the pandemic. But then that switched into looking at what programs we can do to support customers. A lot of us were able to do some creative things. In our case, we were able to roll forward some unspent DSM money from a balancing account and provide a kind of one-time refund for customers as we move through the summer. But we also wanted to focus on educating our customers on how to work now that you're at home. To the extent we had a lot more customers working from home, and we have a pretty advanced rate designs in Arizona. How can you take advantage of time use rates? So you're at home now, and we have a peak period from 3 p.m. to 8 p.m. So there's great opportunities for pre-cooling that might be harder to do if you're not working from home, but something that we want to make sure customers knew how to do in working from home. And the last thing from just a prep standpoint was not losing sight of the long term. So making sure that we did some scenario modeling as to what would happen if it's a long pandemic, short pandemic, deep financial impact, shallow financial impact. And we'll probably come back to that in a little bit. But what we saw initially, not surprisingly, was a pretty significant decrease in commercial and industrial loads. Less on the industrial side, mostly commercial, as all the restaurants and the bars and the salons shut down. Arizona was in a shutdown mode from kind of mid-March until towards the end of May. Some of you may be aware that we exited that in May, and we've been struggling to contain the virus in the state. But what we saw is residential loads go up, not enough to offset the decline in the commercial and industrial class. But we did see an increase in residential loads. As we opened the state, that trend essentially flattened out. And so we continue to see a little bit of an increase in residential loads, and the decline in commercial and industrial loads narrowed. And so right now, we're in a pretty hot period. It's going to be 113 degrees, I think, here today in Arizona. And so we're seeing weather impacts. But when we look at weather normalized load, we're seeing some decline, not quite fully offset from the increase in residential load with the commercial load, but we're certainly seeing that come back. With respect to revenues and expenses, we have realized some savings in things like travel. I think we're all looking at, particularly for us, we have a lean Sigma initiative underway, and we're looking at how we can capture some of the savings that we're seeing right now. So in terms of travel reductions, work from home, we want to make sure that we take advantage of some of the opportunities that we see with that. But what we're seeing in increases is not just the exposure to bad debt, which is yet to see how that will work out. And we're going to be working pretty flexibly with customers on payment arrangements and things like that. But we're also seeing, for example, testing. We've got a pretty robust testing program where we test all of our control room operators, all of our critical employees, almost on a weekly basis, whether they're symptomatic or not. We designed that partnership with Arizona State University. That's been helpful in helping us to manage the pandemic within the company, but we're burning $500,000 a month on testing, and so we're certainly seeing some impacts from the supply chain side, from some of the other exposures to expenses that we're incurring. Again, we're working to see how we can offset that with some natural savings, and then we'll kind of TBD is what happens with the bad debt. From a cost of capital standpoint, I think the probably most interesting thing as the pandemic started is we saw a real tightening in the credit markets. And so we lost access early on to commercial paper. So credit the Fed, and I know that's an upcoming question, credit the Fed to opening up commercial paper markets. We tapped our revolver. So a revolver is essentially like a home equity line of credit. Think of it that way. And so we tapped our revolver. It's a higher cost of debt, but we wanted to make sure we had liquidity early in the crisis. We were able to work that out. We have seen just the volume of debt that is out on the markets right now. We've seen credit spreads come down. And so we were able to replace the revolver with some longer term debt at a pretty attractive interest rate. And I think that's going to be one benefit to customers, is that we are seeing access to the debt side. I don't think that's going to translate on the equity side. I think cost of capital on the equity side is going to continue to reflect the uncertainty right now in the environment. But on the debt side, just the volume of debt transactions that are out there has helped us to secure lower long-term debt. And again, we've worked off the revolver now. We have a kind of open revolver if we need it. And we've moved that financing into longer-term debt. And we're pretty much financed now through the rest of the year. So I think that's been a positive story as the Fed has come in with some aggressive intervention and helped us to provide liquidity. And with that, I'll stop, Ahmad.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Just a very quick clarifying question. You mentioned the impact across the three sectors: residential, commercial, and industrial. Just at a big picture level, how are your revenues split up across those three sectors?
Yeah, so we get a little bit more than probably half our revenue from residential. We get maybe industrial is a little light in Arizona, so probably 15% or so from industrial, and then I'd say 10 to 15% from commercial, and the rest is kind of just miscellaneous.
Okay, got you. Excellent. Well, thank you. That was very, very insightful and has raised a few questions that we will save after the three panelists have spoken. So next on this sort of random order here is Matt.
Hey, thanks, Ahmad. So a lot of my story is very similar to what Jeff laid out, starting in really mid-February as the coronavirus was kind of moving around the world. our emergency response team started implementing our pandemic response. That really went into full response in the second week of March, where we started looking at conducting a drill on March 13th, where we'd have everybody who could work from home. And that drill rolled right into the following Monday, where the majority of the New York metropolitan area really shut down. So implemented our pandemic response, did things that we really had never done, moved more than half our workforce remote, things like the 700 folks who work in our call centers, and lots of folks have call centers remote. We'd never done it. Moved all those folks over the course of a weekend to remote working. Implemented really a restricted set of work for field forces, very similar to what Jeff outlined. It was about how do we keep those essential things going to keep the lights on, keep the gas flowing, but minimized all of the work, and really over about a week or two, waited for things to stabilize, which really involved multiple weeks of minimizing work activities and spreading out our employees. So we worked with both the city and state emergency management folks, did things like open remote workout locations. So if you think of New York City, our service territory, it really is very dense urban environment. Our workout centers often have a couple hundred employees in a very small space. So we were able to work with the city and state to get space where we could essentially spread our crews out. So if we had an outbreak at one workout center, it wouldn't take out everybody at the whole workout center. Minimize the amount of work, shut down all of the things that we could defer. New York City was impacted pretty significantly in the first part of this. So at our peak, we had something like 400 employees who were out with COVID, and about another 1,000 employees who were quarantined at the peak. That has all come way down. So it's been multiple days since we've had our last diagnosed case. I think New York City, for the first time in months, has gone a day without any COVID fatalities. And things have really kind of stabilized significantly in New York. New York has begun to reopen. And as it reopens, we've begun to slowly phase work activities back in, including restarting things like our AMI program, meter reading, planned work, new service connections. All those kind of things are starting to ramp back up. We definitely saw a very similar impact to loads, as what Jeff described. Commercial loads were off by up to 20%. Commercial things being like the business centers in Manhattan, Midtown, downtown. Residential loads increased, but not enough to fully offset the decrease in the commercial load. So overall system loads to the whole state are down. We do not have a lot of industrial load. New York City area is not a lot of heavy industry, so it's really commercial and residential. Of that, the residential loads were higher, and Con Ed is a T&D only utility, so we are delivery. We only procure energy for our full service customers, but we don't own any generation. We are revenue decoupled, and we did start to see relatively large RDM balances building up in places. So negative balances for residential customers and fairly large positive balances for the commercial customers. So we need to look at some of those things and how we could potentially do to kind of smooth out impacts over time. And that's something we've been looking at. As Jeff mentioned, there was a discontinuation of a moratorium on disconnects. We also waived late and reconnect fees. And that's led to an interesting issue. So we are revenue decoupled. So there's revenue decoupling for us, which means that we're not really looking at a revenue shortfall from the T&D business, but there is a certain amount of expected revenue in each of our rate cases around those kind of late fees and disconnect fees. So when you waive that, those are gone. So we have seen some reduction in expected revenues for the year. As far as cost of capital, Jeff laid out kind of what had happened with the debt markets earlier in the year, and I think as he indicated, those have smoothed out. I do think that on the equity side, folks are kind of watching what is going on with state regulators, how they're going to address some of these uncertainties, things with, what are they going to look at with RDM balances? What are we going to do with some of the uncertainty and how those things get addressed? And, there's definitely some more volatility there than people have seen, and likely will pay that price on the equity side.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Just a terminology question. What is RDM?
Oh, so RDM, or is a revenue decoupling mechanism, common to many states, but not all. That allows us to essentially true up the revenue expected by service class based on usage. So it is an incentive to allow the utilities to push things like energy efficiency programs that may reduce overall send out and sales volume and not impact the overall revenues. New York having a fairly aggressive energy efficiency goal, we have had revenue decoupling, or RDM, for a number of years.
So the second question was, to what extent has the policy of the federal government and also the state and local governments been helpful from the standpoint of helping utilities deal with both the customer aspects of the pandemic as well as the financial impacts that they're experiencing? So sort of broadly speaking, has government policy been helpful or challenging, and any specific comments you have on the subject would be quite appropriate to make. So just rotating the sequence, let's begin with Matt on this one, and then we'll go to Jeff, and hopefully Bob would have called in at some point. So Matt.
Hey, Ahmad. So on the government policy front, I think everything in the near term was just around stabilization and kind of getting through the crisis. So as I indicated in the earlier comments, New York kind of was at the epicenter of a lot early. Major focus on how do we limit spread quickly. So things like government orders to shut down construction activities, energy efficient activities, really all activities drove us early. And there are some implications of those things. So we have, for example, incentives around achieving certain energy efficiency goals and targets. We actually have earnings adjustment incentives that go towards those things. And when you shut those down for 3 or 4 months at a time, we won't achieve those for this year. As we come out of this, there was a law passed in New York that kind of paralleled what the utilities had already done proactively in the state. So as Jeff had indicated in his comments, similarly, Con Ed and all the utilities in New York State had a moratorium on shutdowns and a moratorium on disconnects, moratorium on collections and late fees. That was actually codified in the law in New York State, that there's a requirement until the state of the governor's declaration ends, utilities can't shut down residential customers or collect late fees for non-payment. So that will carry forward and have some implications to it. The New York State PSC opened a proceeding around COVID impact. They had about 40 questions they asked both utilities and other interveners to respond to. And those comments are actually going in this week. So we'll see what we get from that. So I think there's still going to be more to come on what both the government and regulatory impact is in the longer term for us.
Great. Thank you. So Bob, you want to just give it a shot to see if we can hear you?
Yeah. How's this?
Perfect.
Very good. Very good.
Great. All right. I'm on by phone. Yeah. I won't repeat the great comments that Jeff and Matt made. What I would suggest, given the diversity of the audience, maybe the most important thing is to ask what matters the most to all of us. And fundamentally, that is maintaining the quality, the safety of service to our customers and the safety of our employees. Matt, there's actually a great column by Peggy Noonan early in the crisis in mid-March. She's walking around the streets of New York City where you serve and where your team was really so challenged and in some cases devastated. And she's just reflecting on the virus, but she has this one paragraph. There are millions of warnings out there and a million serious things, and we add one. Everything works and will continue to work as long as we have electricity. What keeps the lights on, the oxygen flowing, the information going. Everything is the grid, the grid, the grid. So whether you work for an electric or gas company, you're in the finance or academic community, or particularly if you're a regulator, that's something I think we all share a deep interest in.
Enter your access code
What
or meeting number,
I would
followed by
suggest a foundation is, and really you've heard about this already, is what do we need to do right now?
Enter your attendee ID number, followed by pound. If you do not know your attendee number, press pound to continue.
To meet our responsibilities to customers. And this actually gets to the comment that Eric posted just as we were getting started. So act now. I think Matt said we all have pandemic plans. We all learned from H1N1. One learning we had was give as many people laptops as you possibly can, because you don't know when they're going to need to go home. So initially paying attention to operations, paying attention to the safety of our employees, and reaching out to do the right things to customers. So everyone in the industry committed to working with customers, not just through shut-off moratoria, but really reaching out to partner with our customers long before there were any kind of governmental expectations, formal or informal. You heard about the way we reorganized the way we work, crews working in pods, customer service reps working at home, multiple backup centers for both the electric and the gas transmission systems. But then at the same time, thinking about what we need to do going forward. I know that's something we will get to. From our perspective, serving a huge service territory, but being a relatively small company measured by market capitalization, the roles that we play in our communities, the partnership opportunities are really key. One of the things I was pleased by was, in addition to making what were for us pretty substantial charitable contributions to our communities and customers, employees and even board members stepped up as well. And that's just the nature of the industry we work in. I think you already heard from Jeff and Matt what's happening to loads, and that's a national phenomenon, and then I know we'll continue to discuss government actions. Last thing I would say here is a couple of papers to look at. Probably all of you have seen them, by Tony Clark and Ray Gifford and Matt Larson. Tony, of course, is a former FERC commissioner. First paper was very reactive. What do we need to do right now? It's the kind of things we talked about. Second paper, farther looking. What do we need to learn out of this as we go back to whatever normal may look like? We continue to plan the evolution of the grid. We continue to learn how to do our jobs differently. And again, that's true whether we work at electric or gas company, work at a state commission, work in finance, work at a university. And again, apologize for the chaos getting on.
The chaos is part of the new normal, Bob. So I guess it was a demonstration to us of how the pandemic has already changed a few things. Well, thank you very much. Glad you were connected. So Jeff, what are your views on the role of government, federal, state, and local, in helping you and your customers cope with the pandemic?
Yeah, and I think if you look at the really broadest level at the federal stimulus support that was provided, that was actually, I think, incredibly helpful in a really broad way. And so, I think in general, 99% of our customers don't want to just say, "Oh, great, we've got a disconnection moratorium. I'm going to stop paying my bill until that comes off." There are a handful of cases of folks who can arbitrage or monetize that, but for the most part, I think customers really want to pay their debts and obligations. We really just wanted to reflect that not everyone's going to be able to do that, and so this is not the time to look at charging late fees or interest or things. So I think we as an industry all took that position. But what was helpful with the stimulus package and the additional unemployment support is that customers who were affected are, for the most part, still paying their bills. And so, yeah, we know that we're going to see some increased bad debt, but I think the support that the federal government has provided has been helpful. And also with respect to support for small businesses, 99% of the companies in Arizona are small businesses. And so the impact on small businesses from this pandemic truly is historic, and any support that can be provided. So payroll protection plan, everything that was provided to help support those small businesses is ultimately helping all of us, as they pay rent, as they pay utility bills, and avoid shifting that onto a deferral bucket or some other mechanism that then ultimately gets picked up by other customers. And so at the first level, I just think the federal support and stimulus has actually been quite helpful. Some of the more challenging things on the government side, we're all different from a regulatory standpoint. There's such variety in the U.S. in terms of the regulatory models and the policies that individual commissions take. And so just to contrast Matt's position, we're not revenue decoupled. So we aren't decoupled in Arizona. And our commission discussed after, I think, a helpful NARUC. NARUC's been very helpful in, I think, providing information to all the regulators on things to watch, because ultimately that's going to come back to customers. If we're affected, if our credit rating's affected, if our cost of debt is affected, that may lag, but ultimately that cost will get passed through to customers. So maintaining healthy utility important in the long term, and I think most people realize that. We discussed whether to do deferrals or have a blanket utility deferral for bad debt in Arizona, and ultimately our commission staff prefers to do that on an individual basis. So again, I think the conversation's been helpful, but we're navigating that, and I think you'll see a lot of differences around the country as folks approach that. The last thing, just as you think about how pervasive government involvement is, one of the things we focused on early was making sure that the regulations that were coming out around the shutdowns did not trip us up. And so, you can imagine if you're working an outage and your state puts in place a mandatory 14-day quarantine before someone could go in, that will affect critical work that could have really impacted our summer run. And so we ended up having to coordinate pretty carefully with both our state level, I think the federal government was helpful in terms of thinking through essential work and trying to make it clear as to what that was, but even down to the jurisdictional, like the municipalities. We had an outbreak at our Four Corners power plant, which is on the Navajo Nation. As many of you may know, the Navajo Nation has suffered a tremendous hit from the virus, and that made its way into our plant. And there was a period of time when we were contemplating, shutting the plant down, just because of, to try to get a hold of it. And ultimately, we were able to work with the nation and implement a testing protocol that got us stabilized, up there. But there is a lot of government work, whether it's on the stimulus side or whether it's just on the simple things of making sure that your employees can get to work or be working on a job site that's critical to maintaining reliability.
So it took a lot of cooperation from multiple parties to keep the lights on. I mean, that's truly a miracle. I mean, I was thinking that the first thing to go would be darkness would descend on us of a different kind, because unfortunately people will get infected in the control rooms, or people would not be able to fly airplanes because the control ATC would shut down. I mean, there were all kinds of draconian scenarios that thankfully didn't come to pass. One quick question before we go to the last topic that came in through the chat was, you have a number of customers, as you mentioned, on time of use rates and their particular pricing periods. When people's lifestyles change suddenly and they're stranded at home, they're sheltering in place, did that create some kind of tensions? And did that ultimately result in your either suspending the time of use rates or changing the time periods?
Yeah, it's a great observation and a great question. It absolutely did create some tension. And so just, as a reminder of how you think about those rate designs, when you have a time of use rate, you're pricing artificially low off-peak hours to try to incent consumption. And then our peak is 3 p.m. to 8 p.m. on weekdays. So it's not on weekends. And the peak period is artificially high. And so you're just trying to shift load off. And what we have done, and this is probably common in most time of use plans, is we say weekends and holidays are basically free days. So we don't measure demand on weekends and holidays. And so the initial tension that came up was customers saying, well, this is kind of like a weekend for me, right? I'm home. I'm stuck at home, so I want you to just, give me weekends and holiday rates, 7 days a week. And unfortunately, if you think about rate, equity across customers who are on one of 3 different rate plans, either a time of use with demand, a time of use with just energy, and then a flat rate, which is typically our lower consumption customers. If we were to do something like that, the structure of the rate just doesn't work, and so one is your peak period is reflective of your system peak. And we do see a drop when that time of use period goes. We see the customer behavior change. There's a lot of customers who've programmed smart thermostats. So as soon as you change that time of use period, their programming gets all screwed up. And so it was really important for us to just continue, but to, again, ensure that customers, we were on TV quite a bit in some of the home, television, reminding folks that if you're at home, you can pre-cool, you can turn the thermostat down. Now, again, this started in April, beautiful weather out here, so there wasn't a hot air conditioning load. But the idea now, Todd, is you can pre-cool in the off-peak period and then just turn the thermostat up a few degrees when you go into the peak period. But it absolutely does create some tension because, again, customers don't understand rate design. They're not, that's not we wouldn't expect that. And so the concern about, well, let's just go to off-peak all the time, that would have, you just can't do that with these rates.
That's what they did in Ontario, Canada, as I think we discussed earlier. The Premier decided to just institute off-peak prices in all hours.
Yeah, and
there was elation, but then came the big deficit in revenue. And
exactly.
Now in November, they're going to have a rate hike, which nobody's going to like or appreciate. So they're thinking of reintroducing inclining block rates. And, you open a sort of a can of worms and various creatures come out of the dark. I am personally on a time of use rate. I have solar, for better or for worse, with the time of use rate, and nothing has changed. The sun is shining just like it always did, and I am consuming power like I always did. Yeah, there's some tension at home, but there are many other sources of tension. So one just goes on with life. Okay, so now we are into the third topic.
Ahmed, if I could stay with that for just a minute, I do think the last couple of months have exposed an awful lot of weaknesses in how prices are set through regulation for investor-owned companies. And prices are set quite differently for the rural co-ops around us, obviously, leaning much more on fixed charges plus an energy charge, plus some kind of a capacity charge. You had actually a really good article I'm looking at in the current IEEE magazine talking about the disconnect between the cost structure and the pricing structure. And again, I think that gets to the point that Eric was raising in his chat comment at the start of the call. So looking at pricing structure, I think, is one area we can certainly focus on together coming out of that. There's some lessons learned. To me, the basic lesson at this point, again, what matters most in our work together and then going forward, do no harm and really look at the substance of what we do as well as how we do it, the process, the regulatory process, and our internal processes.
So in a sense, if I heard that correctly, you're saying there's an opportunity here to revisit some of those disconnects that have been there for years and years and decades between rate design and cost of service, and try to use this as an opportunity to make improvements. Is that a fair?
One of countless things that we have all learned out of the last several months.
Yeah. And before I move on to the last topic, let me see if Matt wants to add anything on this this question that we have just been discussing for the last few minutes about rate design and cost of service and how that dynamic is going to be affected either positively or negatively by the events triggered by the pandemic.
Yeah. Thanks, Ahmad. So I think New York has historically, with us being a revenue decoupled state and being delivery utility only, we are a little closer to a model that has us deriving our revenue for the fixed cost of the system and being a little bit less exposed to the things that came up in this. That's not to say we are completely, because there are elements that we really are. But when you look at this, it probably does have opened some opportunities to talk to regulators about ways to think of recovering the costs for our fixed energy delivery infrastructure, recovering costs for increasingly ambitious environmental and decarbonization programs, which in a lot of the Northeast are now becoming bigger and bigger spends that we need to figure out how to socialize effectively and efficiently and fairly. And to have a set of incentives that works well to reduce or increase energy efficiency and increase positive electrification. So I think there's a number of factors here, all of which kind of the pandemic discussion can help influence.
So there is a silver lining in some respects to the pandemic. Okay, so that brings us to the last question, which is, let's imagine a future in which the pandemic has finally receded into the past and historians are busy writing an analysis of what happened, et cetera, et cetera. The question is, as you look at the future that has emerged once the pandemic has abated, do you see structural changes taking place, first of all, in the economy of your region, and number two, in the electricity consumption profiles as well as levels that flow from that, and ultimately, therefore, in your revenues and business model? And I'll just leave it at that general level and let you comment. I have some specifics that hopefully, if time allows, we'll get to at the end. So how about sort of just randomizing the sequence of the panelists? If you begin with you, Bob, commenting on what will be the legacy of the pandemic, let's say on utilities and regulation.
I would say to some extent, my experience has been that this heightened the disconnect between how we're able to do things internally as a company on the one hand, and the interaction with the regulatory structure on the other. It's been a great partnership in many cases, but some of the tensions around formal processes, pricing are still there, but great opportunities for us to work together. And I do want to recognize that the commissions we work with have had to make adjustments to meeting online, to acting very rapidly on some matters and changing circumstances. To me, the most important lesson coming out of this is that we can, as companies, even as regulated companies, very old companies, be relatively nimble, be agile in how we do things, shifting hundreds and hundreds of employees to online communication rather than face-to-face, using our VPNs, using our laptops, moving people to remote locations, continuing to work safely, continuing to meet all of our expense and capital budgets with savings. So the muscle memory I want us all to take away is that we can be agile when something matters. We can change the way we work. Secondly, we've all been working on infrastructure modernization. One of the things I'm pleased about is we've been able to deal with supply chain issues, workforce issues, and continue our capital investment in our gas and electric delivery systems for these years. So going back to that idea of doing what you have to do right now and looking long term, I've had a couple of great meetings over the last week working on evolution of our very rural distribution systems. That's work that continues. The idea of partnerships internally and externally. We've been spending an awful lot of time, not on this platform, but actually on secure Zoom calls with our employees in 50 or 60 different locations, just keeping everyone engaged. There's a lot of talk about the second operating system. It's something I'm a fan of, the notion that there are formal structures and there are informal structures that are increasingly important. They need to be reconciled. A big part of crisis action response is really empowering an alternate second operating system through an incident command structure with parallel structures in different parts of an organization, and then ensuring that even though we are socially isolated, we are still able to communicate. And then taking the same thing outside and how we work with our communities and customers.
Ahmad? Did we lose Ahmad?
We may have. Victor, why don't I just, I'll
Sure.
add to Bob's comments. I think there a couple of maybe observations about the long-term impact. I think we will see resiliency really become more of a focus. And we had started working before the pandemic with the Department of Defense around military microgrids, and it actually built a microgrid at the Marine Corps Air Station in Yuma with the Department of the Navy that is in rate base. And so it's not it's a little bit of an unusual project because a lot of folks, I don't think of microgrids as being a rate-based item. But it's been remarkably effective over the weekend. Again, 114, 115 degrees in Phoenix over the weekend. There was a 500 megawatt combined cycle unit tripped, caused a frequency in the Western interconnection. The microgrids immediately started to pick the load up. And as soon as they sensed the frequency deviation, they converted into frequency response. And so we had rate-based that unit, that Marine Corps Air Station unit, on a frequency response basis. And so it shows, again, I think, a nice opportunity that you can support things like hospitals or bases or military, but still have that effect and support broadly the overall customer base. And so, again, I think resiliency is going to continue to be an important conversation that the pandemic here may have actually heightened, about how we make sure that these critical facilities stay open. The other thing that I think is going to be more of a challenge, particularly as we think about how our clean energy commitment, moving to 100% carbon free by 2050, is affected, is the urgency of returning good economic growth to our territory. And so we were seeing a robust customer growth in Arizona, a fair number of data centers like the profile. We're not really hit by hurricanes. We're not really hit by earthquakes. We've got a pretty nice, stable service territory. It does get hot, a little bit hot. It's a dry heat. But there were a lot of folks who are interested in building manufacturing and other good high load factor loads in the state. And that was really the value that growth has in picking up, the fixed costs associated with changing electric infrastructure is an important piece of our plan. And so as we think about the transition to a more clean energy economy, what we've been focused on is recognizing that you can't just say, well, there's going to be a big rate impact, and that's going to be, that's just what customers are going to have to support. You can get good economic growth. That growth will pick up a fair amount of the customer impacts as you're replacing resources with more clean technology. And so we're going to be very focused on making sure that through our partnerships with both the state and some of the economic development organizations here, that we get the growth back on track as quickly as we can. I hope that doesn't become a longer term impact of the pandemic, is that it's caused a significant bump in the growth pattern of the state.
So Jeff and Matt, I wonder if I could ask a question. I wonder if your states appreciate the roles that you play, obviously, in providing the critical infrastructure that allows for safety, security, and growth, but also just the basic economic impact of your year-over-year investments, sustained investments in the state, not just one project, but ongoing capital budgets.
Yeah, but Bob, I'll start. I think that's probably underappreciated. I mean, it typically comes up in rate cases when you're trying to impact the economic. We're the state's largest taxpayer, for example, and so that does a lot to support basic infrastructure in the state. But we're also have one of the largest supply chains in Arizona. We do the most in terms of our supply chain. And actually, there's a great opportunity as you think about driving diversity, inclusion, and equity. There's a lot that you can do through that supply chain that can have a statewide impact. And then, the last piece, as you called out, is that you are investing a significant amount of capital into the state. It's bringing jobs. It's got a multiplier effect. And it is good to remember that, but we probably don't do a good enough job of making sure that folks do understand that broader impact.
So you brought up an issue that I was thinking, and by the way, I had a momentary outage. It was AT&T doing their number, and I have reached out a few times. They said it's just congestion caused by the pandemic. I'm thinking of switching to Comcast. That's a long story. So let me, I don't know what I missed during the 1 minute I was gone, but you brought up an important issue that came up in the first webinar as well, which is the revenue implications long-term, recovering that revenue that was not collected. And some states have decoupling, as we have discussed. Some states don't. Some states have rate cases, or they have revenue recovery mechanisms of another kind. That has been our practice in prior years, but nothing like the pandemic has ever happened in recent memory, at least. This could be a humongous challenge. So the question is, do you see new innovative ways developing of recovering those revenues? Will it be pretty much the same, which is a rate case or decoupling, but the magnitudes we are talking about could be substantially higher? And would that cause regulators to hesitate, or even if they were to approve them, is it possible that the legislature or the governors might intervene? What's your take on that sort of cosmic piece of uncertainty that is just beginning to emerge?
Ahmad, maybe I can jump on that one first. Clearly, there's a number of financial issues that we have as we think about coming out of the pandemic and what will customers face, both on the residential and commercial side. I think the pandemic is one piece of a number of financial challenges that we're going to face when you think about cost to customers. I think Jeff mentioned that growth will help us to some degree in this area, but in an area of the country where we're seeing less growth than maybe the Southwest, we are likely facing some cost pressure on customers. The pandemic will be one piece of that, how we think about lost revenue there. But New York, we're looking at very aggressive decarbonization legislation. The New York State goals are to have 100% decarbonization of the electric system by 2040 and an 85% reduction in carbon emissions economy-wide from 1990 levels by 2040. That's going to drive a lot of electrification, both for heating and transportation, which are large investments in and of themselves. So I think as we look at kind of the share of wallet and customer impact on energy in its entirety and fuel switching from carbon-based energy to increasingly clean electricity, we are going to have to be conscious of the cost impact. And it's really not just a simple kilowatt hour cost impact anymore. I think it's really looking at what is the overall cost of energy to customers from the multiple sources that they get today, and what does that look like in the future? What investments are we going to need to make that happen? And as far as the revenue lost in this exercise, I think one of the things you just have to be conscious of is that all of these plans, whether they're in New York, the New England states, across the country, they involve utilities making significant investments in grid modernization and decarbonization that we're going to have access to capital markets for. So we have to think about the volatility potentially of earnings and how we signal that as both utility companies and regulators, essentially to the investment community and what investing in our companies means for them.
Very well put. Bob, do you want to add your perspective on this issue?
Sure. Just a couple of things. Actually, where Matt ended is a good place to pick up. We are a capital-intensive industry. We provide our states most critical infrastructure, most essential service. We can't do that without the confidence of both the debt and equity markets. And on both sides, the sector is being watched very, very closely. Typically, in fact, as the ratings agencies have moved to be more transparent, they highlight state regulatory policy as up to 50% of a driver for the ratings. Ultimately, it's in all of our interests to have the confidence of the ratings agencies and the support of equity investors as well. So going through this period, that's extremely important, and it's very helpful for regulators to communicate that they understand that and that they want to work with both the companies and the customers to get through this. I think about half the states, or possibly even more, plus the district, have now looked at some kind of a revenue, a lost revenue mechanism dealing simply with bad debt, and bad debt is up for almost everyone. That seems appropriate, particularly with an accounting order where you are not guaranteeing a return. And a good reference point actually is going back to how actually the industry stepped up immediately after federal tax modifications to ensure that essentially the full value of the federal tax reductions went through to customers, for the most part, not waiting for rate cases, but allowed that to happen this year. So symmetrically, it certainly makes sense to be sure that happens right now. Again, going forward, though, to that question of what matters most, and Matt touched on this in terms of resilience, reliability, a path towards decarbonization. Those are things that have to be addressed through changing the pricing structure and modification of the regulatory structure. One goal I would like to have, again, within the spirit of partnership, would be for regulators to have much more visibility into the great work, the creative work that our system planners are doing, as well as more visibility into the equally important and creative work our folks are doing directly with our customers.
So since you were both a regulator and actually the chairman of a commission, as well as the president of NARUC, and of course you're now the CEO of an electric utility, you have seen both sides of the conversation. Do you see, this is a broad question, do you see any encouraging signs coming from the regulatory side of the conversation to facilitate the transition of utilities in this new challenging environment into successful entities that have a long-term future?
Yeah, and my regulatory career was long ago and in a galaxy far away, and Victor and I were probably focused more on telecommunications back at that time. But yeah, there are a lot of good things that state commissions are doing in terms of the formal structure, moving away from historic test years, looking at various kinds of alternative forms of regulation. It's a very difficult ball of yarn to unwind. A project I was particularly interested to look at in its early stages was what was going on primarily in Minnesota with the Great Plains Institute and the work they were doing around, we're thinking about form and process as well as substance, and you really have to do that. Lots of states are using more informal and collaborative processes. I'm a big fan of ADR. Also, just on the industry side, refer to it as management by walking around, really understanding what's happening on the ground, what our employees are doing, getting visibility into planning. But I really would take it back to what matters most. One purpose of regulation is, quote, control of monopoly power. Well, the biggest of us in the utility sector aren't that big in the economy overall. So certainly that's something to be aware of. When I was a regulator, actually, there was a serious discussion in NARUC about the end of regulation, and would regulation at some point be replaced by consumer protection, UDAP and other statutes, and by possibly antitrust. obviously safety, environmental, labor, on and on. So that's still a fair question to ask. I think there is a role, but I think fundamentally the most important role is also as stewards of critical infrastructure and essential service. And if that's what you get up in the morning thinking is the most important thing, you'll probably go about your day a little bit differently. But at the end of the day, chances are you'll feel like you did something good for your community and for society.
Excellent. So a question that just came up through the chat to me is how will regulators and will regulators be willing to accommodate the special needs of utilities that arise when customers in difficult circumstances are unable to pay their bills? The utility has to stay credit worthy. The customer has lost their job, is unemployed or partially employed, and it's really a struggle, if you will, as to who will help whom. So there are three players in this. There is the government, there is the utility, and there is the customer. That triangular equation has, for the most part, for 99% of the customers, worked out reasonably well, one might say. But 40 million plus employed, the pandemic still stretching out, and the challenges rising in the US on how long it will last. Do you see, so that could become something so problematic that in our previous webinar, which had a regulatory focus, somebody proposed a theory. It's certainly not me. That seems not me.
Yeah, could somebody is has a microphone on. I can't see who. Please turn it off.
Looks like it went away.
Yeah.
So the question is, where do we go from here if the pandemic lasts longer than expected, if the economy doesn't recover and utility unrecovered revenues rise to such a level that the decoupling kinds of mechanisms cannot do the job? And so in our last webinar, a suggestion was made that if utilities go bankrupt, obviously this is a draconian scenario, but if this lasts for 3 years and you have 100 million unemployed, who knows what could be the scenario? This is a draconian scenario. You see government ownership kicking in. This is a question you may or may not want to answer, but if you want to, please go ahead.
I think, Ahmed, the challenge, I think there is a benefit to the investor-owned utility model, and you can just think about it in the sense of how you allocate risk between consumers and companies. And so, I think in some ways, we and our customers will be probably better able to weather this pandemic than a municipal utility, which doesn't really have a lot of options. A municipal utility essentially has to collect all the money from somebody, no matter what. And there's a little bit of a cushion that is just worth remembering that the investor-owned model brings, which is that you have to be very careful that it doesn't affect your long-term ability to finance, that it doesn't affect your access to capital. But you have a layer of shareholder protection is a bit of a buffer. And so it's just worth remembering that layer doesn't really exist with co-ops, and it doesn't really exist with municipal utilities, where they don't have access to a shareholder base to help manage through some of those events. So I certainly hope that we don't get into that position. I think it would be much more challenging to get to the clean, the future that most of us, I think, see of decarbonizing without the real access to capital, that strong balance sheet, good access to equity investors, clearly a partnership with the regulator.
Yeah, I would echo Jeff's comment. I mean, so the question is not an unreasonable question, but it's a bit of an academic question, because if you assume we have 3 years, I think was the time frame you had said, of continuing with significant unemployment and economic dislocation, to assume that governments will be well positioned to take over utility operations may be a little extreme. I mean, even today, I live in New Jersey, and the government of New Jersey is really struggling with the impact of this. So I think the utility model and the investor-owned model works well. It allows us to smooth out some things. I don't think we're looking at 3 years, so I think it's kind of an academic question. I think things will restart, and our industry has survived more than just this. Most of our companies have been through multiple world wars and an economic dislocation, and we figure out how to make it work, and I think we will going forward.
What I would add is that the public sector, private sector, and the NGO sector have all been extraordinarily challenged over the last few months, and the longer this continues, the more that will be true. On the other hand, there are key roles for each of those sectors, again, pulling together to build and rebuild strong communities. The investor-owned sector, I think, does a particularly good job at long-term planning, at investment, at flexibility, but we do that in a regulated setting and with partnership, again, with government, nonprofits, and with customers. Underlying most regulatory structures, there's cost of service. We don't, for the most part, get to charge a market-determined price. Bad debt is one cost of service. Fortunately, certainly in our service territory, we've got great customers, we've got good programs in place to support them, but as that cost of service, as that element of cost of service moves up, at some point it has to be addressed and compensated, or you do risk real financial weakness. And again, it exposes concerns about pricing structures that are so volumetrically driven, and whereas that is only volume is only one measure of the cost structure.
So on that,
Bob, I think you mentioned
go ahead.
this. No, I think Bob mentioned the article as we opened this that this all continues to work, and as much as everything is on and off center, as long as the lights stay on, it continues to work. We do underpin a huge piece of the economy, and our ability to continue to do that, I think, is critical to this. So as long as we continue to do our part, I think the economy likely restarts, and I think we're already beginning to see kind of the light at the end of the tunnel of what new normal looks like, which I think in the Northeast, particularly in New York, we're a little ahead of some other places because we went through the darkest, and I really feel here like it's starting to return to a different normal, but more normal than it was. And I know everybody in different parts of the country in different places.
You certainly faced the brunt of it very early on. The whole world's eyes actually were on New York. And it's quite a relief to see that, by and large, obviously there were fatalities, and obviously there were lots of human, emotional kinds of challenges for the survivors. But by and large, some new normal, as you said, has emerged. So the last question I have in the time that remains is, you mentioned decarbonization, electrification, broad policy initiatives that were there before the arrival of the pandemic. One of the other initiatives that was there was perhaps to some extent market-driven, and that was the emergence of this new DER revolution, as some people call it, or photovoltaics paired with storage, et cetera, et cetera. Do you see that continuing, the momentum that was there for transforming the globe, the US, from centralized power to decentralized power? It could be microgrids, as was being mentioned. It could be rooftop solar. It could be battery storage paired with rooftop solar, or other variations. That whole thrust was partly ideological and partly driven by economics. What has the effect of the pandemic likely to be on that movement? Is that movement going to be sustained, or will it fall by the wayside?
So, Ahmad, was that question for me for kind of New York with New York Rev, which was early, very focused on distributed markets and how some of those things would work? Okay. So, yeah, independent of the pandemic, I think there are elements and aspects of New York Rev that had evolved in some of the policymaker thinking as we moved over and through the last several years. So I think there was a lot of optimism around distributed resources, and clearly distributed resources like solar storage, generation, all of those elements are important pieces of how we think about making an energy delivery system work in the future. And that was a big focus of New York Rev, and I think we accomplished a lot in that. But as we move from Rev to what is the more recent policy discussion around what's called CLCP, or Climate Leadership Community Protection Act, that really is looking for the main focus being on decarbonization. And in that, I think there's been a pivot back towards some of the larger resources. So doesn't take distributed resources out of the mix or discussion. They're going to be a piece of it. But I think we've moved towards larger resources, wind, offshore wind, large scale solar, transmission projects, potentially additional interconnections to Canadian hydro, blended with distributed resources in a broader package that looks at both decarbonization of electric supply and elimination of carbon-based fuels in other parts of the economy, particularly heating and transportation. So it's an element, but I don't think it's the primary focus of the policy discussion in New York anymore.
Okay, great, thank you. So Jeff and then Bob, 2 minutes each.
Yeah, on that, I think what you'll see is it expands. So we have about 10% of our residential customers with rooftop solar today. The rooftop solar market continues to be robust. I think we'll continue to see that and probably see some additional expansion into storage. But I think the decentralization thing is broader because it's going to really move into more devices. So think smart thermostats, think home energy management systems. All things that tie back to underlying rate designs that can actually send a price signal so that somebody can figure out, how to make a Nest thermostat worth buying. If all you have is an inverted block rate, Nest thermostat does not do you much good. If you have a time of use period and you can manage your air conditioners off peak, there's value that you can get for investing in the thermostat. So I just encourage folks to think of that distributed piece, which is key to our decarbonization plans, is going to be having customer participation. But we should think broadly about that because it's likely going to go into more devices and, broader than we're probably thinking today.
Got you. Okay, thank you very much. Bob, you get to have the last word.
Yeah, I'll go back again. What matters most? And are we facilitating choices and thoughtful evolution of the grid, or are we potentially disabling them? And Victor, I'm looking at you, going back to your career focused on telecoms infrastructure. There were a lot of good policies, but there were a lot of disablers too. I'm thinking of the Unbundled Network Element Platform, if you remember that, as an artificial creation to promote a certain form of decentralization that really didn't work. And there are some analogs to that in the energy sector at this point. On the other hand, if you think about an evolution, deployment at the speed of value. We talk about it in terms of a journey map, a rational deployment with one step leading towards the next, and doing that while bringing along, consulting with your customers, consulting with policymakers, and having policy focus really on the high ground, and then leaving the responsibility up to the industry to figure out how to get there, again, with a lot of consultation and flexibility and being sure that you're providing value. I think ultimately, just as in telecoms, the intelligence wasn't always at the network. Turns out that as intelligence becomes cheaper and cheaper, every part of the network potentially becomes enabled and empowered. It's going to look very different in Manhattan than it is in rural Montana or the Dakotas, but the strategies, if they're enabled, can evolve, I think, and provide real customer value.
Well, thank you very much, all three of you. It has been a great conversation, despite two technology disruptions. So with that, Victor, back to you to close the session.
Well, thanks very much, Ahmad. Thanks very much to the speakers. The one clear message that I get is that in this environment, it looks like the companies and the regulators are trying to work together, and the federal government are trying to work together to smooth the disruptions that have been created by the pandemic. And it's a hopeful sign to me. And the other point that's kind of interesting that maybe we need to pick up on that Bob just mentioned is that intelligent devices at the edge and intelligent network, those are two keys to evolution of networks, and there may be a lot of business opportunities there that haven't been discussed yet. So with that, I want to thank our presenters, Matt, Jeff, and Bob, and our great moderator, Ahmad, who's golden tongue. And despite the technical glitches, I think this was a very good session and a very good companion piece to the one we've already done. And it's interesting that the two sessions, one from regulators and one from company senior executives, seem to almost harmonize. And that's opposed to, if we want to get a little bit literary, do you remember Kurosawa's Rashomon, the film where everybody has a different perspective based on their own self-interest? Here it seems like there's a common perspective, and the interest is satisfying public needs, and that is very uplifting to me. So at some point in the future, I'd like to bring all of you together again as to look at this from a different perspective as we have a longer time period to reassess what's gone on and to see what if your opinions have changed. But in any case, thank you again, and thank you for everybody who was listening. This was a wonderful session. Take care, everybody.